Please welcome Kylie Jenner and her mommy, Kris Jenner.
It's actually the only dress of mine that I don't own. So if anyone out there making a public announcement has my dress, call me, because it's priceless to me and I need my dress.
From the outside, Kylie Jenner's life looks unreal. Billions in valuation, global influence, a face recognized everywhere, a name powerful enough to move markets with a single post. To the world, she represents the ultimate modern fantasy: youth, beauty, money, and control. But images don't tell the whole story. They rarely do. Because behind the billionaire headlines and perfectly curated photos exists a reality the public doesn't like to sit with. A reality where success arrives too early, too fast, and without an off switch. Where identity forms under cameras instead of privacy. Where growth happens in front of millions and mistakes never disappear. Kylie didn't grow into fame. Fame grew around her. And when your sense of self is built while the world is watching, the line between who you are and who you're expected to be starts to blur. The brand becomes louder than the person. The image becomes more valuable than the individual maintaining it. This isn't the story of how Kylie Jenner became rich. It's the story of what happens when success arrives before emotional armor does. Because sometimes the most expensive thing success costs you is yourself. Kylie Jenner's story didn't begin with ambition in the traditional sense. There was no long climb, no years of obscurity, no gradual adjustment to attention. Her life unfolded in reverse: visibility first, identity later. Before she had the space to understand who she was, the world had already decided who she should be. From a young age, Kylie Jenner existed inside a system designed for consumption. Cameras didn't just capture moments, they shaped them. Reactions mattered, appearances mattered, silence mattered, and childhood, something most people used to experiment, fail quietly, and reset, became content instead. That environment changes how reality feels. When you grow up watched, you don't develop privacy naturally. You learn performance. You learn which versions of yourself receive approval and which ones create backlash. Over time, approval becomes guidance, not consciously, but psychologically. The brain adapts. It starts optimizing for safety through acceptance. And acceptance, in Kylie's world, was visual. How she looked became more important than how she felt. Not because she chose vanity, but because attention trained her nervous system to associate appearance with control. When praise follows a certain image, that image feels safer. When criticism explodes around deviation, conformity feels protective. That's how the image started leading the person. As the years passed, Kylie's transformation became public conversation. Every change dissected, every shift magnified. Strangers debated her body, her face, her choices, as if ownership came with viewership. And while criticism was loud, praise was conditional. It came with expectations attached. Be confident, but not too confident. Be relatable, but still aspirational. Be natural, but flawless. These contradictions don't cancel each other out. They pile up. Inside that pressure, Kylie did what many people would do. She adapted, she refined, she curated, and eventually she built a brand powerful enough to overshadow the noise. The billionaire image didn't just represent wealth, it represented control. Proof that she wasn't just surviving the spotlight, she was winning inside it. But winning externally doesn't quiet internal tension. Because brands don't feel emotions, people do. The more the image solidified, the harder it became to step outside it. When your livelihood, reputation, and validation are tied to a specific version of yourself, evolution feels dangerous. Growth risks destabilizing the thing that keeps you safe. So you stay consistent, even when consistency feels suffocating. This is where mental reality diverges from public perception. The world sees luxury, autonomy, power. What it doesn't see is how exhausting it is to be permanently on. To know that rest can look like irrelevance, that authenticity can look like weakness, that vulnerability can turn into headlines. Kylie didn't get the luxury of being unknown first. She didn't get to build confidence privately. Her insecurities didn't form in silence. They formed under commentary. And insecurity amplified by millions doesn't shrink. It multiplies. People often assume wealth eliminates anxiety, but anxiety isn't about resources. It's about uncertainty. And when your identity depends on maintaining an image others profit from, uncertainty is constant. One bad headline, one shift in public taste, one moment of perceived inauthenticity. Suddenly, safety feels fragile again, so the image becomes tighter, more controlled, more distant, not because she doesn't care, but because caring openly feels risky. Emotional exposure invites interpretation. Interpretation invites judgment. Judgment invites loss of control. And control in Kylie's world equals survival. This is the paradox of early success. It accelerates achievement before emotional resilience has time to develop. You get the rewards before you get the tools to handle them. And by the time you realize what's missing, the stakes are already too high to step back and learn quietly. Kylie's billionaire status became a shield. It proved competence. It silenced certain critiques. It reframed her narrative from famous for being famous to self-made powerhouse. But shields are heavy, and wearing one constantly changes posture. You stop relaxing. You brace. That bracing shows up in subtle ways, in guarded interviews, in controlled messaging, in a distance that feels polished but emotionally unavailable. Not because she's cold, but because warmth has consequences when misread. The audience often demands realness without understanding the cost of giving it. They want authenticity, but only the kind that aligns with their comfort. They want honesty, but not messiness. Strength, but not struggle. And when those expectations clash, the safest option is restraint. So Kylie learned restraint. And restraint, over time, can feel like erasure. Because when you're constantly managing perception, you lose access to spontaneity, to being unfiltered, to existing without strategy. Even joy becomes performative when it's always observed. Even pain becomes something you hide, because pain invites speculation. The mental reality beneath the billionaire image isn't despair, it's pressure. Pressure to stay relevant, to stay admired, to stay composed, to stay profitable. And that pressure doesn't disappear when you close your eyes at night. It follows you into silence. The world often asks how someone so successful could struggle mentally. But that question misunderstands the situation entirely. Success doesn't remove psychological strain. It changes its shape. It replaces survival stress with identity stress. It trades scarcity fear for visibility fear. And visibility is relentless. Kylie didn't choose to become a symbol, but she became one anyway. A symbol of modern success, of influence, of monetized identity. And symbols don't get to be confused, or uncertain, or still figuring things out. People do. And that gap between symbol and person is where the real tension lives. As the image grew stronger, the distance between who Kylie was and who she was expected to be grew wider. And that distance didn't announce itself with breakdowns or scandals. It showed up quietly, in emotional restraint, in guardedness, in a life that looked full but felt tightly managed. Because when your identity becomes a product, spontaneity becomes a liability. Kylie's success didn't just come from visibility, it came from consistency. The audience knew what to expect. The brand delivered a specific fantasy: luxury, beauty, effortlessness, and fantasies only work when they're uninterrupted. One moment of visible doubt, one expression of uncertainty can fracture the illusion. So uncertainty had to stay private. But keeping emotions private doesn't make them disappear, it just pushes them inward. And when that inward pressure has nowhere to go, it reshapes how you experience the world. Happiness becomes cautious, trust becomes selective, even confidence becomes something you rehearse rather than feel. The world often interprets Kylie's reserved demeanor as detachment, but detachment is often a coping mechanism, not a personality trait. It's what happens when reacting freely Kylie has taught you painful lessons. When every emotional response is recorded, dissected, and monetized, emotional distance starts to feel like self-protection, and protection becomes habit. One of the most misunderstood aspects of Kylie's mental reality is isolation. People assume isolation comes from being alone. In her case, it comes from being constantly surrounded by teams, cameras, schedules, expectations, surrounded by people who depend on the image continuing uninterrupted. That kind of environment blurs sincerity. When feedback is filtered through brand strategy, it stops feeling personal. Compliments feel calculated. Criticism feels amplified, and neutral reactions feel rare. Over time, it becomes difficult to tell who is responding to you and who is responding to what you represent. That uncertainty erodes grounding. Grounding comes from consistency of self, knowing who you are regardless of how others react. But when your formative years are shaped by reactions instead of reflection, grounding is fragile. Identity forms in response rather than intention. Kylie's adulthood didn't arrive with a clean slate. It arrived with years of narrative already written about her, who she was, what she symbolized, what she should be grateful for, what she had no right to complain about. That last one matters because public success often invalidates private struggle. The more you have, the less you're allowed to hurt. And that social pressure can be suffocating. It teaches you to minimize your emotions, to feel guilty for feeling anything other than gratitude. But gratitude doesn't cancel stress, and privilege doesn't erase pain. What it does is make pain harder to express. So instead of speaking openly, Kylie's emotional world became quieter, less expressive, less accessible. Not because there was nothing inside, but because expressing it risked misunderstanding. And misunderstanding at her level spreads fast. This is where the billionaire image becomes psychologically complex. On one hand, it offers validation. Proof of competence, proof of power, proof that she's more than the assumptions placed on her early on. On the other hand, it locks her into a narrow definition of worth. When your worth is measured by valuation, you start measuring yourself the same way. Am I still valuable? Am I still relevant? Am I still desirable? Those questions don't disappear with money. They intensify because now the stakes are public. And the irony is that the more successful Kylie became, the less room she had to fail safely. Failure, for most people, is private and temporary. For her, it would be amplified and permanent. That fear alone is enough to keep anyone hyper-vigilant. Hyper-vigilance looks like control. Control looks like calm. But calm doesn't always mean peace. Behind the composed exterior is constant monitoring of perception, of trends, of audience mood, of relevance. It's mentally exhausting to always be slightly ahead of judgment, to anticipate backlash before it happens, to adjust before criticism forms. That kind of mental load doesn't show up in photos. It shows up in emotional flattening, in reduced risk-taking, in staying within what's known to work instead of exploring what might feel fulfilling. Because fulfillment is unpredictable, and unpredictability is dangerous when your image supports an empire. Kylie's mental reality exists in that tension, between wanting to be human and needing to be consistent, between personal evolution and brand stability, between inner complexity and outer simplicity. The audience often wants a clear narrative, either victim or victor, insecure or confident, controlled or empowered. But real people don't live in absolutes. They live in contradictions. Kylie can be powerful and overwhelmed, successful and uncertain, admired and emotionally guarded. Those states can coexist. What's rarely acknowledged is how early success interrupts emotional development. When external validation arrives before internal identity is formed, self-worth becomes outsourced. And reclaiming it later is difficult, especially when the external system benefits from you not changing. Growth threatens predictability. Predictability protects profit. So even when Kylie steps back, becomes quieter, reduces visibility, the pressure doesn't fully lift. Because absence itself becomes a statement, silence becomes analyzed, distance becomes interpreted. There's no neutral move when you're this visible. And that's why the billionaire image is both empowering and imprisoning. It gives her leverage, but it also sets the terms of engagement. It rewards consistency over curiosity, stability over exploration, image over introspection. The mental cost isn't dramatic collapse, it's constant compression. Compression of emotion, compression of expression, compression of self. And over time, compressed things either adapt or crack. Kylie's story isn't about breaking. It's about managing weight most people never have to carry. The weight of being watched while becoming. The weight of being defined before deciding. The weight of success arriving before the self is ready to hold it. And that weight doesn't disappear just because the world calls you a billionaire. It just becomes quieter. By this stage, the pressure is no longer about achievement. It's about maintenance. Keeping the balance, holding the structure steady, making sure nothing slips. Because even small shifts feel magnified when your life operates at this scale. This is where mental strain becomes normalized. Not dramatic, not explosive, just constant. Kylie's world runs on predictability. Schedules, launches, visuals, narratives. Everything has a rhythm designed to minimize risk. And while that structure creates enormous success, it also narrows emotional range. There's very little space for confusion, very little tolerance for indecision, very little room to pause and ask, what do I actually want right now? Because pausing costs momentum. And momentum is everything. Over time, this creates a subtle form of disconnection, not from others, but from self. When your decisions are always filtered through impact, brand alignment, and audience reaction, intuition starts to quiet down. You don't stop having feelings, you stop trusting them. And that's dangerous in a quiet way. The public often interprets Kylie's calmness as emotional stability, but calm can also be emotional containment. It can be the result of learning that visible emotion leads to loss of control, that showing too much invites projection, that expressing uncertainty becomes a liability rather than a process. So restraint becomes intelligence. Distance becomes wisdom. Silence becomes safety. But safety built this way comes at a cost. Intimacy, not just romantic intimacy, but emotional closeness in general. Real closeness requires vulnerability, and vulnerability requires the freedom to be misunderstood without consequence. Kylie doesn't have that freedom. Misunderstanding doesn't stay small in her world, it spreads. So connection has to be managed carefully. Trust becomes slow. Emotional openness becomes selective, and even then, there's always the awareness that nothing exists fully outside the public frame. That awareness is exhausting. Another overlooked part of her mental reality is comparison, not with peers, but with her own image. When the internet preserves every version of you, growth becomes complicated. You're not just evolving forward, you're constantly being compared backward. You at 17, you at 19, you at the height of virality. And when people prefer an older version of you, it can feel like rejection, even if you've objectively grown. That's because acceptance becomes conditional on familiarity, not truth. This creates internal conflict. Am I changing too much? Am I losing what made people like me? Or am I finally becoming myself? Most people get to answer those questions privately. Kylie has to answer them while millions watch and comment. That pressure encourages emotional neutrality. When reactions are unpredictable, neutrality feels safer than authenticity. But neutrality overused becomes numbness. Not emptiness, but a flattening of highs and lows. The danger isn't sadness, it's disconnection. And disconnection often hides behind success because success keeps you busy enough not to notice it immediately. There's always something to focus on, something to manage, something to optimize. Productivity becomes a distraction from introspection, but introspection always waits. It shows up late at night, in quiet moments, in the space between launches. That's when questions surface that no amount of money can answer. Questions about meaning, about identity beyond appearance, about worth that isn't tied to performance. And those questions are harder when your entire world reinforces performance as value. The audience often debates whether Kylie is happy, But happiness isn't the right metric. Stability is. Agency is. Emotional freedom is. And emotional freedom is hard to maintain when your life has been shaped by visibility since adolescence. Kylie didn't choose the conditions under which her identity formed, but she has had to live with their consequences. And those consequences don't resolve with age, they evolve. What once felt overwhelming becomes familiar. What once felt invasive becomes routine. But routine doesn't equal health. It just means the nervous system adapted. Adaptation isn't the same as peace. The most complex part of her mental reality is that there's no clear problem to solve, no single villain, no obvious escape. The system works, the image performs, the success continues, which makes questioning it feel ungrateful, even internally. So the struggle stays subtle. It lives in guardedness, in control, in emotional efficiency. And while the world sees a billionaire who has it all, what it doesn't see is how carefully everything must be held together to keep that image intact. Kylie's story isn't about collapse. It's about compression under expectation. About growing up without emotional anonymity. About succeeding without space to fail quietly. About being admired without being fully known. And that kind of life doesn't break you loudly. It reshapes you slowly. It teaches you how to survive visibility, but not always how to rest from it. At some point, survival stops feeling like strength and starts feeling like habit. You keep going not because it's fulfilling, but because stopping would force you to confront a question you've been postponing for years. Am I doing all this by my own choice or because I'm forced to do it? This is where Kylie's story quietly arrives. Not at collapse, not at rebellion, but at awareness. Because the longer you live inside a perfectly functioning system, the harder it becomes to imagine life outside it. The billionaire image doesn't just give you power, it defines the limits of your freedom. It tells you who you're allowed to be, how far you're allowed to change, and how much truth you're allowed to show before it disrupts the structure holding everything up. And structures resist disruption. Kylie Jenner is often described as private now, reserved, controlled. People mistake that for coldness or disinterest, but privacy when earned late is rarely about secrecy. It's about recovery, about reclaiming pieces of the self that were never allowed to develop off camera. The irony is that the more she pulls back, the louder the speculation becomes. Silence invites theories. Distance invites judgment. Boundaries invite backlash. Yet boundaries are often the first sign of internal clarity. Because clarity doesn't look dramatic. It looks quieter. It looks like choosing less visibility instead of more. Less explanation instead of justification. Less performance instead of constant reassurance. But that choice comes with consequences. When your value has been tied to presence for most of your life, absence feels risky. When attention has always equaled relevance, stepping away feels like disappearing. And when disappearing threatens the systems that benefit from you being visible, pressure returns. Subtle, but persistent. So even self-protection has limits. That's why the billionaire image is so psychologically complex. It suggests autonomy while quietly restricting it. It promises freedom while demanding consistency. It rewards strength while discouraging vulnerability. And this contradiction doesn't resolve cleanly. There's no moment where Kylie wakes up and figures it all out. Growth at this level doesn't come as answers, it comes as better questions. Questions about purpose beyond profit, about identity beyond aesthetics, about fulfillment beyond validation. Those questions don't trend, they don't monetize, they don't photograph well, but they matter. And they matter even more when your life has been optimized for everything except internal alignment. The public often frames Kylie's story as either empowerment or emptiness, but reality lives in the middle. She is powerful and constrained, successful and emotionally guarded, admired and isolated in ways most people will never experience. The mental reality isn't misery, it's management, managing perception, managing expectation, managing self-expression, and management is tiring, especially when it's lifelong. What Kylie represents represents isn't just wealth. She represents a generation raised inside algorithms, metrics, and monetized identity. A generation that learned early that attention has value and that losing attention feels like loss of self. Her story is extreme, but it's not foreign. Many people today feel pressure to maintain a version of themselves that performs well, online, professionally, socially. The scale is different, but the psychology is similar. When identity becomes external, peace becomes conditional. And that's the quiet warning inside Kylie's story. That success without emotional privacy comes at a cost. That validation without grounding creates fragility. That winning too early can delay knowing who you are without the applause. Kylie didn't fail at success. She mastered it before she fully understood herself. And now, like many who reach the top too fast, she's left with a different challenge. Not how to get more, but how to feel whole inside what she already has. The billionaire image will always exist, but the person behind it is still evolving, still protecting, still adjusting, still learning how to exist without being consumed by expectation. And maybe that's the most human part of all, because true success isn't about what the world sees. It's about whether you can live with yourself when the cameras are off. If this story made you think differently about fame, success, and the unseen mental cost behind perfect images, like the video, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. We tell the stories behind the headlines, the ones that don't shout but stay with you.